The cold water of the Blackwater River rushed over Tessa Armstrong's boots as she screamed her daughter's name, the sound torn from her throat and carried away by the roaring current. The spring flood had come early to Wyoming Territory in 1873, turning the normally placid crossing into a deadly torrent that had swept away her wagon and now threatened to take the only thing in this world she truly cared about: Lily. Tessa screamed again, her chestnut hair whipping across her face as she stumbled along the riverbank. 20 yards downstream, the wicker basket containing her 9-month-old daughter bobbed among the whitecaps, spinning slowly toward the center of the swollen river. Tessa had been changing Lily on the bank while her horses drank, never expecting the sudden surge of water that had come barreling around the bend, spooking her team and sending her wagon crashing into the river. In the chaos, the basket had been swept from the bank, with precious Lily still inside. Tessa plunged into the icy water, her long skirts immediately becoming waterlogged, dragging her down. The current pulled her feet from beneath her, and she found herself thrashing in the frigid water, gasping for air, still desperately reaching toward the basket that continued to float just beyond her grasp. From atop the ridge overlooking the river crossing, Blake Harrington lowered his Winchester rifle and narrowed his eyes at the scene unfolding below. He had been tracking a small herd of pronghorn when the woman's screams cut through the afternoon air. Without a second thought, he spurred his stallion down the rocky slope, sliding to a stop at the water's edge just as the woman disappeared beneath the surface. Blake shed his duster, gun belt, and boots in one fluid motion. Years of working cattle had taught him the deadly power of water, but nothing would stop him from diving into the churning river. With powerful strokes, he cut through the current toward where he had last seen the woman, the basket now drifting dangerously close to the rapids downstream. Tessa broke the surface, choking and sputtering, her lungs burning with the cold. The current had dragged her 20 feet downstream, and the basket with Lily was now nearly 50 yards ahead, approaching a section where the river narrowed between jagged rocks. She tried to scream again but swallowed water instead, her strength rapidly fading as her sodden clothes pulled her under once more. Blake reached the woman just as she started to sink. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to the surface. "The baby," she gasped, flailing against his hold. "My baby's in the basket." Blake's heart hammered against his ribs. "Hold onto my neck," he commanded, his voice cutting through her panic. When she complied, wrapping her arms around him like a vise, he struck out toward the floating basket, fighting the current with every ounce of his strength. 50 yards had never felt so far. The basket spun in an eddy, momentarily caught before the river pulled it free again, sending it careening toward the rocks. Blake could hear the faint cries of the infant now, the sound spurring him on despite the burning in his muscles and the weight of the woman clinging to his back. With a final desperate lunge, Blake's fingers grasped the edge of the basket just before it would have been dashed against the rocks. He clutched it to his chest with one arm, using the other to fight the current, angling toward the far shore where the water ran less swiftly. "I've got her," he panted to the woman whose arms had loosened around his neck. "Stay with me, just a little farther." The last 50 feet to shore seemed to take an eternity. By the time Blake's feet found purchase on the rocky riverbed, his legs were leaden, and his lungs felt scorched from exertion. He staggered the final steps to the bank, carefully laying the basket on dry ground before collapsing to his knees, the woman sliding from his back to crawl frantically toward her child. Tessa pulled Lily from the basket, clutching the soaking wet infant to her chest. To her immense relief, the baby wailed loudly, her face red with indignation rather than blue from cold. "She's alive," Tessa sobbed, rocking the baby in her arms. "Thank God she's alive." Blake sat back on his heels, water streaming from his clothes, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. For the first time, he got a good look at the woman he'd rescued. Despite her bedraggled appearance, with her dress clinging to her slender frame and her long chestnut hair hanging in wet ropes around her face, she was strikingly beautiful. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, met his with a gratitude that struck him speechless. "You saved us," she said, her voice breaking. "We would have died if you hadn't come." Blake found his voice at last. "What were you doing crossing alone? The river's at flood stage." "I didn't try to cross," she explained, shivering. "I stopped to rest the horses. The water came so suddenly." Her voice trailed off as she looked across the river to where her wagon lay on its side, half submerged in the current. "Everything I own is in that wagon." Blake followed her gaze, assessing the situation. "The wagon's lost, madam, but you and your little one are safe, and that's what matters." He stood, wringing water from his shirt. "My horse is on the other side. I'll find a safe place to cross and bring him around. We need to get you both warm and dry before night falls." "I'm Tessa," she said, clutching the now quieter baby. "Tessa Armstrong, and this is Lily." "Blake Harrington," he replied with a nod. "My ranch is about 5 miles from here. We can shelter there tonight." Tessa looked down at Lily, who had begun to shiver in her wet clothes. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No need for that," he said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "And it's just Blake. I'll be back as quick as I can. Try to wring out some of those clothes if you can." As Blake made his way upstream to find a crossing, Tessa hugged Lily close, watching the tall cowboy disappear among the cottonwoods. She had been making her way west for 2 months, ever since her husband Thomas had died of fever in St. Louis, leaving her alone with a baby and dreams of the new life they'd planned to build in Wyoming. Now, with her wagon and supplies gone, those dreams seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon. Blake returned 30 minutes later, leading his chestnut stallion. He had retrieved his boots and duster, which he immediately draped over Tessa's shoulders. "It'll be dark soon," he said, helping her to her feet. "Can the little one ride?" Tessa nodded, still cradling Lily, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep. "She'll be fine." Blake lifted them both onto his horse before mounting behind them. Tessa stiffened at the unfamiliar closeness of a man she barely knew, but the warmth of his body against her back and the security of his arms around her, as he took the reins soon, had her relaxing against him, too tired to maintain her reserve. "I was heading to a place called Whitewater Creek," she said as the horse picked its way carefully through the brush. "My husband's brother has a homestead there." Blake's arms tightened almost imperceptibly around her. "Whitewater's a good 3 days' ride from here, especially with a little one." He paused. "Your husband?" "Dead," she said simply. 4 months ago." Blake digested this information in silence as they rode. The sun was setting by the time they crested a small rise, revealing a tidy ranch nestled in a protected valley below. A main house of hewn logs stood surrounded by several outbuildings, with corrals holding horses and cattle beyond. It wasn't a large spread, but it spoke of hard work and care. "Rafter H," Blake said, a note of pride in his voice. "It's not much, but it's home." As they approached, a weathered older man emerged from the barn, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip until he recognized Blake. "Hank," Blake called out, "get a fire going in the house. We've got guests who need warming up." The man, presumably Hank, took in the sight of the bedraggled woman and child with a raised eyebrow, but asked no questions as he hurried to do as asked. Blake helped Tessa dismount, taking Lily from her arms as she stumbled, her limbs stiff from the cold ride. "Steady now," he murmured, supporting her with one arm while cradling the baby with the other. "Let's get you both inside." The house was simple but comfortable, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall of the main room. Hank had already stoked a fire to blazing, and the warmth hit Tessa like a physical force as they entered. "Hank, this is Mrs. Armstrong and her daughter Lily," Blake said, handing the baby back to Tessa. "They had some trouble at the river crossing. They'll be staying with us tonight." Hank nodded. "Madam, I'll put some coffee on." "Thank you," Tessa said, suddenly overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers after the terror of the afternoon. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched Lily closer. Blake noticed her distress. "Hank, there are some of Sarah's old things in the trunk in the back room. See if you can find something dry for Mrs. Armstrong and the baby." As Hank disappeared down a hallway, Tessa looked up at Blake. "Sarah," a shadow crossed his face. "My sister. She stayed here for a while last year." He didn't elaborate further, moving instead to stoke the fire. "You should sit, Mrs. Armstrong. You've had a hard day." Tessa sank gratefully into a chair near the fire, unwrapping Lily from her wet blankets. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her cheeks pink with warmth returning to her tiny body. Hank returned with an armful of women's clothing and a small blanket. "These ought to fit well enough," he said gruffly, setting them on the table. "There's a room down the hall where you can change. I'll have some food ready when you're done." Tessa thanked him and followed his directions to a small bedroom, where she quickly changed herself and Lily into the dry clothes. The dress was plain but clean, if a bit large, and she cinched it at the waist with a belt she found in the pile. For Lily, she fashioned a makeshift diaper from a soft cloth and wrapped her in the blanket Hank had provided. When she returned to the main room, Blake was seated at the table, a steaming cup of coffee before him. He stood when she entered, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her transformation. With her hair combed and dry clothes on, Tessa was striking tall and slender, with a quiet dignity that belied the desperate situation she'd been in just hours before. "Mrs. Armstrong," he said, pulling out a chair for her. "You look recovered." Tessa offered a small smile as she sat, Lily nestled in the crook of her arm. "Please call me Tessa, and yes, dry clothes work wonders." Hank set plates of beans, bacon, and biscuits before them, along with a cup of warm milk for the baby. "It's not fancy, but it's hot," he said. "It looks wonderful," Tessa assured him, suddenly ravenous. She shifted Lily to her lap and began to eat, conscious of Blake's eyes on her but too hungry to feel self-conscious. As they ate, Blake told her about his ranch. He'd come west after the war, using the money he'd saved from his army pay to buy the land 5 years ago. With Hank's help, the older man had been a friend of Blake's father back in Missouri. He'd built the house and barns and slowly accumulated a respectable herd of cattle. "It's a good life," he said simply. "Hard work, but honest." "And lonely," Hank added, refilling their coffee cups. 30 miles to the nearest town, and not much there when you get to it. No place for a woman and child, if you don't mind my saying so, madam." Tessa looked down at Lily, who had awakened and was contentedly drinking the warm milk from a spoon Tessa held to her lips. "We don't have much choice now. My brother-in-law's homestead is all we have left." Blake frowned. "This brother-in-law, has he been expecting you? I wrote to him after Thomas died, but I don't know if the letter reached him," Tessa admitted. "Thomas always spoke highly of him, said James had good land and a solid start out here." Blake and Hank exchanged a look that Tessa couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" she asked. Blake set down his coffee cup. "Whitewater Creek's had its share of troubles lately. There's been talk of Indian raids along the northern settlements. Nothing confirmed, mind you, but folks are uneasy. And that's not counting the drought they had last summer," Hank added. burned out more than a few homesteads. Tessa felt a chill that had nothing to do with her damp hair. "Are you saying I shouldn't go?" Blake shook his head. "I'm saying you should know what you might be riding into. James Armstrong, you said. I don't recall the name, but Whitewater's got several dozen families scattered across the valley." "I have his location," Tessa said. "Thomas was very specific in his letters." She hesitated. "But without my wagon and supplies, we can outfit you with what you need," Blake said firmly. "Food, blankets, a pack horse, and I'll escort you there myself." Tessa's eyes widened. "I couldn't ask that of you." "You've already done so much." "You're not asking, I'm offering," Blake replied. "It's not safe for a woman and child to travel alone in this country, especially now. I need to check on some cattle up north anyway." This last part was clearly an excuse, but Tessa was too grateful to question it. "Thank you," she said simply. "Again." After dinner, Hank cleared the plates while Blake showed Tessa to the room where she and Lily would sleep. It was small but neat, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt. "It was Sarah's room," Blake explained, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "There's water in the pitcher if you need it. We'll leave at first light if that suits you." Tessa nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the immediate danger had passed. "Mr. Harrington, Blake, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there today." Blake's expression softened. "Get some rest, Tessa. We can talk more tomorrow." After he left, Tessa laid Lily on the bed and curled around her, the events of the day washing over her in waves. She had lost almost everything she owned, yet somehow felt more secure than she had in months. As she drifted off to sleep, the last thing she remembered was the steady sound of men's voices from the main room and the strange comfort it brought her. Blake rose before dawn, as was his habit, to find Hank already up and cooking breakfast. The older man gave him a knowing look as he entered the kitchen. "Don't start, Hank," Blake warned, pouring himself coffee. "Didn't say a word," Hank replied, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Just thinking it's mighty convenient that you need to check cattle all the way up at Whitewater." Blake ignored the comment, focusing instead on the preparations for the journey. "I've packed supplies for 3 days. Should be enough to get there and back. And if this brother-in-law isn't there, or if he's not in a position to take them in." Blake had been wrestling with that possibility all night. "Then I'll figure something else out. I can't just leave them to fend for themselves." "No," Hank agreed, his weathered face solemn. "That wouldn't be like you at all." Tessa emerged from the bedroom a short time later, Lily in her arms. The baby looked remarkably recovered from her ordeal, her blue eyes bright as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Tessa had done what she could with the borrowed dress and had braided her long hair into a single plait that hung over one shoulder. "Good morning," she said, hesitating in the doorway. Blake stood, oddly flustered. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Lily only woke once in the night." Hank gestured to the table. "Breakfast's ready. You'll want to eat before you head out." Over breakfast, Blake outlined the route they would take to Whitewater Creek. The most direct path would take them across open country for the first day, then through a mountain pass, before descending into the valley where James Armstrong's homestead supposedly lay. "We should reach the pass by nightfall tomorrow," he explained. "There's good shelter there and water. Then it's just a half-day's ride to Whitewater." Tessa nodded, memorizing the landmarks he described. "I can't thank you enough for doing this. Once we reach James's place, I'm sure he'll compensate you for your trouble." Blake waved away her words. "No need for that. Like I said, I have business up there anyway." After breakfast, Blake and Hank prepared the horses while Tessa gathered what few possessions she had salvaged from the river. A locket containing miniature portraits of her parents, a small Bible, and a letter from her brother-in-law giving directions to his homestead. Everything else, clothes, household items, family mementos, had been lost. Hank had found a small pack that could be fashioned into a carrier for Lily, allowing Tessa to keep the baby securely strapped to her chest while riding. He'd also provided a spare dress, some basic toiletries, and a warm shawl from Sarah's trunk. "Sarah won't mind," he assured her when Tessa protested. "She's married and living in California now, has been for 6 months. By mid-morning they were ready to depart. Blake mounted his stallion while Tessa was given a gentle mare to ride. A pack horse carried their supplies, tied to Blake's saddle with a lead rope. "Take care of the place, Hank," Blake called as they rode out. "We'll be back in 5 days or so." "See that you are," Hank replied, his eyes lingering on Tessa and the baby before returning to Blake with an unreadable expression. They rode northwest, following game trails through rolling grassland dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of cottonwood. Blake set a steady but comfortable pace, mindful of Tessa and the baby. Lily seemed to enjoy the motion of the horse, watching the passing scenery with wide eyes before eventually falling asleep in her improvised carrier. "She's a good traveler," Blake observed when they stopped to rest the horses at midday. "Most babies I've known would be howling by now." Tessa smiled, stroking Lily's fine hair. "She's always been easy that way. Even on the journey from St. Louis, she rarely fussed." Her smile faded. "It was as if she knew her father was gone and that we had to be brave." Blake handed her a canteen of water. "How did your husband die, if you don't mind my asking?" "Typhoid," Tessa said, taking a sip before passing the canteen back. "It swept through the boarding house where we were staying. Thomas had just secured our wagon and supplies for the journey west. We were to leave the following week." She sighed. "I sold what I could to pay for his burial, then decided to continue with our plan. There was nothing left for us in St. Louis." "That took courage," Blake said quietly. "Heading west alone with a baby," Tessa shrugged. "What choice did I have? Wait tables at some saloon, become someone's housekeeper. Thomas and I had a dream of land of our own. I couldn't just let that die with him." Blake studied her with newfound respect. Most women in her position would have sought the security of remarriage or return to family back east. But Tessa Armstrong had the kind of determination that the frontier demanded, the same quality that had driven Blake to stake his own claim in this wild country. They remounted and continued their journey, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Blake pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his early days on the ranch. Tessa spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, where her father had been a schoolteacher and her mother the daughter of a prosperous merchant. "They didn't approve of Thomas," she confessed. "He was a dreamer, always talking about the opportunities out west. They wanted me to marry the local banker's son, a perfectly nice man, but dull as dishwater." "And you chose adventure instead," Blake said with a smile. "I chose love," Tessa corrected him. "The adventure was just part of the package." As the afternoon waned, Blake began looking for a suitable campsite. He finally selected a spot near a small creek, sheltered by a rocky outcropping that would block the wind and reflect the heat of their fire. "We'll stop here for the night," he announced, dismounting and helping Tessa down from her horse. "There's good water and grazing for the horses." While Blake tended to the animals, Tessa built a small fire using the skills she'd learned during her journey from St. Louis. By the time he returned, she had water boiling for coffee and was feeding Lily some of the soft bread Hank had packed for them. "You're handy around a camp," Blake observed, settling across from her. "Most city women I've met wouldn't know how to start a fire without burning down the whole prairie." Tessa laughed. "Necessity is an excellent teacher. The first week on the trail, I could barely boil water, By the third week, I was cooking stews that even the wagon master complimented. They ate a simple meal of jerky, beans, and biscuits, watching as the sunset painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Lily fell asleep soon after eating, and Tessa laid her on a blanket near the fire, covering her with the shawl Hank had provided. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Blake added wood to the fire, building it higher to ward off the night chill. "You should get some sleep," he told Tessa. "I'll keep watch for a while." Tessa nodded, moving to the bedroll he had spread for her. She hesitated, then said, "Blake, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Yesterday, at the river, you risked your life for us. You didn't know us, had no reason to care whether we lived or died. Why did you do it?" Blake was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Where I come from, you don't need a reason to help someone in trouble, especially not a woman and child." He paused. "During the war, I saw men turn their backs on others who needed help. I swore I'd never be that kind of man. You were a soldier, Union cavalry, fought from 62 to 65. Saw things no man should see." He stirred the fire with a stick. "After it was over, I couldn't go back home to Missouri. Too many ghosts, so I came west looking for something. Peace, maybe." "Did you find it?" Blake glanced up at her, the firelight casting his face in sharp relief. "Some days I think so, other days not so much." Tessa pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I know what you mean. After Thomas died, I felt so. Adrift. Coming west was the only thing that made sense, the only way to honor what we'd planned together." She sighed. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish, if I'm risking Lily's future on a dream that might never come true." "Dreams are what built this country," Blake said softly. "Without them, what's the point of any of it?" Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Then Tessa looked away, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of their situation, alone under the vast Wyoming sky, sharing confidences as if they were old friends rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. "I should sleep," she murmured, lying down beside Lily. "Good night, Blake." "Good night, Tessa," he replied, his voice low. "Sleep well." Tessa closed her eyes, but sleep was slow in coming. She was acutely aware of Blake's presence a few yards away, of the sound of his breathing and the occasional clink of his spurs as he moved to add wood to the fire. It had been months since she'd felt so safe, and years since she'd felt so seen. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were a confusion of rushing water, reaching hands and dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Dawn broke clear and cold, with frost silvering the prairie grass. Tessa awoke to find Blake already up, brewing coffee over a freshly built fire. Lily was still sleeping soundly, her tiny hands curled into fists beside her face. "Morning," Blake said, handing Tessa a cup of steaming coffee. "Sleep all right?" "Well enough," she replied, taking the cup gratefully. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. "Thank you." They ate a quick breakfast of jerky and hardtack, then broke camp as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill. Lily was fussy at first, unhappy about being confined to her carrier after the freedom of sleeping on a blanket, but soon settled as the rhythm of the horse's gait lulled her back to sleep. The second day's travel took them into more rugged country, with the distant mountains drawing steadily closer. By midday, they were riding through foothills covered in pine and spruce, the air growing cooler and sharper with altitude. "The pass is just ahead," Blake said as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear mountain stream. "We'll make camp on the other side. There's a sheltered valley with good grazing." Tessa nodded, lifting Lily from her carrier to change and feed her. The baby was in good spirits, cooing and grabbing at Tessa's braid with surprising strength. "She's strong," Blake observed, watching them from where he knelt by the stream, refilling their canteens. "Going to be a handful when she starts walking." "She's already trying," Tessa said proudly. "Pulls herself up on anything she can reach. Thomas said she'd be running before her first birthday." A shadow passed over her face at the mention of her late husband, and Blake quickly changed the subject, pointing out a hawk circling high above them. Soon they were back on the trail, climbing steadily toward the pass. The mountain trail grew narrower and steeper as they ascended, forcing them to ride single file, with Blake leading the way and the packhorse between them. In places, the path hugged the mountainside, with a sheer drop on the other side that made Tessa's stomach clench with anxiety. She focused on Blake's broad back ahead of her, trusting in his knowledge of the route. They reached the summit of the pass by mid-afternoon, and Blake called a halt, dismounting to check the horse's hooves for stones. The view was spectacular. Behind them lay the rolling grasslands they had traversed, while ahead, the mountains gave way to a fertile valley, with a silver ribbon of river winding through it. "Whitewater Creek," Blake said, pointing to the river. "And somewhere along it, your brother-in-law's homestead." Tessa shielded her eyes against the sun, trying to make out any signs of settlement in the valley below. "It looks so peaceful from up here." "Most things do from a distance," Blake replied. "Come on, we've still got a few hours of daylight. We can make it to the valley floor before we need to camp." The descent was more treacherous than the climb had been, with loose shale making footing uncertain for the horses. Blake led them carefully, choosing the safest path through rocky switchbacks that zigzagged down the mountainside. By the time they reached level ground again, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. Blake chose a campsite in a grove of aspen trees near a tributary of the main river. The spot offered both water and shelter, with enough open ground nearby for the horses to graze. As on the previous night, Tessa built the fire while Blake tended to the animals, the division of labor now feeling natural between them. As darkness fell, they sat side by side near the fire, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear mountain sky. Lily was already asleep on her blanket, one arm flung above her head in complete abandonment. "Tomorrow we'll reach Whitewater Settlement," Blake said, breaking the comfortable silence. "From there, we can ask directions to your brother-in-law's place." Tessa nodded, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension filling her at the thought of finally reaching their destination. "I hope James will welcome us. He and Thomas weren't particularly close. There was a falling out years ago that they never quite resolved." "What kind of falling out?" "Over their inheritance, I think. Their father left the family farm to Thomas as the elder son with instructions to sell it and split the proceeds. But James wanted to keep the farm, continue working it. Thomas refused, sold it anyway." She sighed. "James came west not long after, and they rarely corresponded. It was only in the last year that they started writing to each other again." Blake frowned. "And you're certain he'll take you in? He's family," Tessa said with more confidence than she felt. "And he's Lily's uncle." "Surely that counts for something." Blake looked unconvinced but didn't argue. Instead, he said, "If things don't work out with James, you should know you have other options." "Such as?" "Well, Whitewater has a small but growing town. There might be work there teaching, perhaps, given your father's profession. Or, Tessa prompted when he hesitated. Blake cleared his throat. "Or you could return to Rafter H with me. We've plenty of room and Hank would welcome the company, just until you decide what you want to do next." The offer took Tessa by surprise. She looked at Blake's profile, strong and steady in the firelight, and felt a rush of gratitude tinged with something warmer. "That's very kind of you." "It's not kindness," he said quietly. "I've enjoyed your company these past days." "And Lily's too," he added hastily. "The ranch can be solitary at times." Tessa smiled, touched by his awkward admission. "I'll keep your offer in mind, but first I need to see what awaits us at James's homestead." Blake nodded, stirring the fire with a stick. "Of course. I didn't mean to presume." They fell silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. The night sounds of the valley surrounded them, the soft rustle of aspen leaves, the distant call of a coyote, the gentle gurgle of the stream nearby. It was peaceful in a way that city life had never been, and Tessa found herself hoping that whatever awaited them in Whitewater would allow her and Lily to remain in this beautiful wilderness. Later, as she lay in her bedroll watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, Tessa allowed herself to consider Blake's offer. The thought of returning to Rafter H was surprisingly appealing. In just 2 days, she had come to appreciate Blake's quiet strength and integrity. Hank, too, had shown nothing but kindness to her and Lily. The ranch might not be what she and Thomas had dreamed of, but it would be a safe haven while she figured out her next steps. But first, she owed it to Thomas's memory to at least meet with his brother. James might welcome them with open arms, offering the family connection that Lily deserved. Or he might turn them away, still harboring resentment over old grievances. Either way, Tessa needed to know. With that resolution in mind, she finally drifted off to sleep. The sound of Blake's steady breathing across the campfire strangely comforting in the vast wilderness. Morning came with a heavy mist that clung to the valley floor, turning the landscape into something from a dream. They broke camp quickly, eager to reach Whitewater settlement before midday. As they rode, the mist gradually lifted, revealing a valley dotted with small farms and homesteads, their fields green with spring crops. The settlement itself was little more than a cluster of buildings around a crossroads: a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church, and what appeared to be a combination saloon and hotel. A few houses surrounded the central buildings, with more scattered along the creek that gave the settlement its name. They drew curious stares as they rode down the main street, the residents clearly unaccustomed to strangers. Blake guided them to the general store, where a gray-haired man in a leather apron was sweeping the porch. "Morning," Blake called, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching rail. "We're looking for a homesteader named James Armstrong. Can you point us in the right direction?" The man leaned on his broom, eyeing them with interest. "Armstrong, you say? Tall fellow, beard, came here about 3 years back." "That sounds right," Tessa said, hope rising in her chest. "He's my brother-in-law." The man's expression changed, a flicker of something pity crossing his weathered face. "You'd best come inside, madam." A knot of dread formed in Tessa's stomach as she dismounted, Blake helping her down before taking Lily so she could more easily enter the store. Inside, the familiar smells of coffee, tobacco, and leather goods greeted them, along with the cool dimness after the bright morning sun. "I'm Elias Donovan," the man said, moving behind the counter. "Been running this store since the settlement was founded 5 years back. And you would be?" "Tessa Armstrong. This is my daughter Lily and our friend Blake Harrington." Donovan nodded slowly. "Armstrong's widow, then. I'm sorry for your loss, madam." "Thomas died in St. Louis," Tessa explained. "I'm here to find his brother James." Donovan exchanged a glance with Blake, then sighed heavily. "I'm afraid I have bad news for you, Mrs. Armstrong. James Armstrong passed away this past winter. Pneumonia took him, along with 3 others in the settlement." The words hit Tessa like a physical blow. She reached blindly for the counter to steady herself, feeling the room tilt around her. "Dead, but his letters. He was expecting us." When did you last hear from him? Donovan asked gently. January, Tessa whispered. He wrote that he was looking forward to meeting Lily in the spring. He took sick in February, Donovan said. Didn't last but a week. We buried him up on the hill by the church. I'm sorry, madam, truly I am. Blake had moved closer to Tessa, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. What about his homestead? He asked. Donovan shrugged. Abandoned now. It was marginal land to begin with, too rocky for good crops. James made a go of it with some sheep, but it was a hard living. The place is about 5 miles north of here, just beyond Cedar Ridge. Tessa felt numb, the news still not fully registering. I'd like to see it, she said finally. And his grave. Donovan nodded. Of course. The cemetery's just behind the church. As for the homestead, follow the creek north until you reach a stand of cedar trees, then head east about a mile. You can't miss it, only cabin out that way. Blake thanked the storekeeper, then guided Tessa back outside, his hand steady under her elbow. Once they were alone, he turned to face her, his expression grave. Tessa, I'm sorry, this isn't what you hoped to find. She shook her head, fighting back tears. I knew it was a possibility. James living alone out here, no one to care for him if he fell ill. She took a deep breath. At least now I know. We should visit his grave before we see the homestead. The tiny cemetery behind the church contained no more than 20 graves, most marked with simple wooden crosses. James Armstrong's was near the back, the earth still showing the mound of a recent burial. The cross bore his name, dates, and a simple inscription. He sought freedom in the West. Tessa stood before it in silence, Lily quiet in her arms as if sensing the solemnity of the moment. Blake waited a respectful distance away, giving her privacy to say goodbye to a brother-in-law she had never met. After a few minutes, Tessa rejoined Blake, her face composed though her eyes were red-rimmed. I'd like to see the homestead now. They rode north as Donovan had directed, following Whitewater Creek as it wound through the valley. The land grew progressively rockier and less fertile, explaining why James had chosen to raise sheep rather than crops. Cedar Ridge was aptly named, a low rise crowned with gnarled cedar trees that stood out against the open grassland. Beyond it, they spotted the cabin, a small, rough structure with a partially collapsed roof. A sheep pen stood empty nearby, and what had once been a vegetable garden was now overrun with weeds. The whole place had an air of abandonment that made Tessa's heart ache. They dismounted and approached the cabin cautiously. The door hung askew on leather hinges, revealing a single-room interior. Inside, everything was covered in a layer of dust. A bed stood in one corner, a table and chair in another. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold ashes still in the hearth. He lived simply, Blake observed, looking around the sparse dwelling. Too simply, Tessa murmured. She set Lily down on a relatively clean patch of floor, letting the baby crawl while she explored the cabin. There was little of value, some cooking utensils, a few tools, a trunk containing clothes and a Bible. No personal mementos, no letters or photographs. It was as if James Armstrong had been trying to erase his past. What will you do now? Blake asked as Tessa rifled through the trunk. She straightened, pushing her hair back from her face. I don't know. I had pinned all my hopes on finding James, on having somewhere for Lily and me to belong. She looked around the cabin. I could try to make a go of it here, I suppose. The land is ours by right as James's only relatives. Blake frowned. This isn't good land, Tessa, and the cabin needs significant repairs before winter. It would be a hard life for you and Lily. What choice do I have? She asked, a hint of desperation in her voice. Everything we owned was lost in the river. I have no money to buy land elsewhere, no family to return to in the east. Blake hesitated, then said carefully, my offer still stands. Come back to Rafter H with me. At least temporarily while you decide what to do next. The ranch has good water, fertile soil, if you wanted to stay permanently. Well, we could work something out. Tessa studied him, trying to read his intentions. Why would you do that? You barely know us. I know enough, Blake said simply. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you're a good mother to Lily. And I know that leaving you here alone would haunt me for the rest of my days. Something in his voice, a sincerity that couldn't be feigned, made Tessa's resistance crumble. She looked around the desolate cabin once more, then at Lily, who was happily investigating a piece of kindling she'd found on the floor. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. All right, she said. We'll come back with you, just until I can make other arrangements. Relief washed over Blake's face. Good. That's good. We should gather anything of value here, then head back to town. We can stay at the hotel tonight and start for home tomorrow. They spent the next hour sorting through James's meager possessions. Tessa took the Bible, finding inside it a faded photograph of two young boys, Thomas and James, in their youth, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling. It brought tears to her eyes, this reminder of a time before estrangement had driven them apart. They also found a small leather pouch containing $20 gold, James's savings, hidden under a loose floorboard by the bed. Tessa hesitated to take it, but Blake convinced her that her brother-in-law would have wanted his niece to have it. It's not a fortune, he said, but it's something to build on. By late afternoon, they had loaded the pack horse with everything worth salvaging and were ready to leave. Tessa took a final look at the cabin, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. James Armstrong had sought a new beginning here, but had found only hardship and an early grave. She hoped his spirit was at peace now, reunited with the brother he had once loved. Back in Whitewater Settlement, they secured a room at the small hotel, actually just 3 rooms above the saloon. The proprietor, a bustling woman named Mrs. Baxter, was clearly delighted to have customers, especially a woman with a baby. Don't get many ladies staying here, she confided to Tessa as she showed them to a clean if sparse room. Mostly just cattle buyers passing through, or the occasional prospector. It'll be nice to have a feminine touch around the place, even if just for one night. Blake took a second room across the hall, insisting on maintaining propriety despite Tessa's protests that he needn't spend the money. I'll sleep better knowing you and Lily are comfortable, he said firmly. And I could use a real bed myself after 2 nights on the ground. They had dinner in the saloon below, which quieted considerably when Tessa entered with Lily. The handful of men at the bar stared openly, then hastily removed their hats and moderated their language. Mrs. Baxter served them a surprisingly good meal of venison stew and fresh bread, hovering over Lily with grandmotherly delight. She's a beautiful child, Mrs. Baxter said, tickling Lily under the chin. Got her mama's eyes, she does. Thank you, Tessa replied, warmed by the woman's kindness. She's a good baby, all things considered. She's had to adapt to a lot of changes lately. Children are resilient, Mrs. Baxter said wisely. More so than we give them credit for, and she has a strong mother to guide her. She glanced at Blake, then back to Tessa with raised eyebrows. And now a protector as well, it seems. Tessa felt her cheeks warm. Mr. Harrington has been very kind, helping us after we lost our wagon in the river. He's escorting us to his ranch while I decide what to do next. Mrs. Baxter nodded, but her knowing look suggested she had drawn her own conclusions about their relationship. Well, it's a dangerous country for a woman alone. You're fortunate to have found such a gallant companion. After dinner, Tessa retired early with Lily, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day's discoveries. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the main street. She bathed Lily using the basin of warm water Mrs. Baxter had provided, then rocked her to sleep, humming softly. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Blake standing in the hallway, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I just wanted to check that you had everything you needed," he said, "and to say good night." "We're fine," Tessa assured him. "Mrs. Baxter has been very attentive, and Lily's already asleep." Blake nodded, seeming reluctant to leave despite her assurances. "Tessa, about tomorrow. I want you to know that there's no obligation. If you decide you'd rather stay here in Whitewater or try to make a go of James's homestead after all, I'll understand." Tessa studied him in the dim light of the hallway, struck by the earnestness in his expression. "Why does it matter so much to you what I decide?" Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "I'm not sure I can explain it properly. These past few days, watching you with Lily, seeing your courage in the face of everything that's happened, you've reminded me of something I think I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That there's more to life than just surviving," he said softly. "That it's worth taking risks for the things, the people that matter." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Tessa felt her pulse quicken, aware that they were approaching a boundary that, once crossed, would change everything between them. "Blake," she began, not sure what she intended to say. He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to say anything now, just think about it. Good night, Tessa." "Good night," she whispered as he turned and walked back to his own room. Tessa closed the door and leaned against it, her thoughts in turmoil. She had known Blake Harrington for only 3 days, yet in that short time he had saved her life, her daughter's life, and had now offered them both a home. It was too much, too fast, and yet there was something about him that inspired trust, that made her believe he was exactly who he appeared to be. A good man with an honest heart. She crossed to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. Whitewater was a struggling settlement, with little to offer a woman alone with a child. James's homestead was even less promising, isolated, with poor land and a dilapidated cabin. In contrast, Rafter H was established and prosperous, with Blake and Hank already proving themselves to be dependable allies. The practical choice was clear. The emotional one was more complicated. Tessa had loved Thomas deeply. Their marriage had been a true partnership, built on shared dreams and mutual respect. His death had left a void in her heart that she had not expected to fill again, at least not for a very long time. Yet here was Blake stirring feelings that both confused and frightened her with their intensity. Was it merely gratitude, the natural response of a vulnerable woman to a man who had protected her? Or was it something more substantial, a recognition of qualities in Blake that resonated with her own values and hopes? Tessa had no answers, only questions that chased themselves around her mind as she finally turned from the window and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would shape her and Lily's future. For tonight, all she could do was rest and trust that the morning would bring clarity. Dawn came too soon, the early light filtering through the thin curtains to wake Tessa from a fitful sleep. Lily was already awake, babbling happily to herself in the makeshift crib Mrs. Baxter had provided, actually a dresser drawer padded with blankets. Tessa dressed quickly in the clothes Hank had given her, then tidied her hair into a simple braid. She packed their few possessions, including the items salvaged from James's cabin, into a carpet bag Mrs. Baxter had generously donated. When she and Lily went downstairs, they found Blake already at breakfast, talking with a man Tessa didn't recognize. Blake stood as they approached, his face lighting up in a way that made Tessa's heart skip. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," she replied, settling Lily on her lap. "Who was that man you were speaking with?" Blake glanced toward the door where the stranger had just exited. "Name's Collins. He's the closest thing Whitewater has to a land agent. I was asking about James's homestead." Tessa frowned. "Why?" "Because if you decide to sell it, Collins might know of a buyer. It's not much, as we saw, but someone might be willing to take it on. That would give you a bit more capital to work with, whatever you decide to do next." The thoughtfulness of his actions touched her. "Thank you, that's very helpful." Mrs. Baxter appeared with a plate of eggs and bacon for Tessa and a small bowl of porridge for Lily. "Eat up, my dears. Growing girls need their strength, and so do their mamas." As they ate, Blake outlined the return journey to Rafter H. "If we make good time, we can be through the pass before nightfall. Then it's just one more day's ride home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, pregnant with meaning. Tessa nodded, making her decision. "I'd like that. To see Rafter H again, I mean. And for Lily to have some stability for a while." Blake's expression was carefully neutral, but Tessa caught the flash of pleasure in his eyes before he turned his attention to his coffee cup. "Good, that's good. We'll leave whenever you're ready." An hour later, they were on the trail again, heading back through the valley toward the mountain pass. The morning was clear and cool, perfect for traveling, and Lily was content in her carrier, occasionally pointing at birds or animals they passed with excited babbles. As they rode, Tessa found herself thinking about the future with more hope than she had felt in months. Blake's offer provided a respite, a chance to catch her breath and consider her options without the immediate pressure of survival. Perhaps, in time, she might even find a permanent place at Rafter H, not as a charity case, but as a contributing member of the small community Blake and Hank had built. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. It would mean opening herself to new possibilities, to relationships she hadn't planned for when she set out from St. Louis. But wasn't that the nature of the frontier? Adaptability, resilience, the courage to embrace the unexpected. They reached the base of the pass by early afternoon and began the steep climb. The trail seemed narrower than Tessa remembered, with loose shale making footing treacherous for the horses. Blake led the way, occasionally looking back to check on Tessa and Lily, his concern evident in the set of his shoulders. They were nearly at the summit when disaster struck. A rattlesnake, sunning itself on a rock beside the trail, startled Tessa's mare with its sudden movement. The horse reared in panic, nearly unseating Tessa. She clutched at the saddle with one hand, the other holding Lily securely in her carrier. "Steady," Blake called, turning his mount to help. "Pull up on the reins gently." Tessa tried to follow his instructions, but the mare was too frightened, dancing sideways on the narrow trail until its hoof slipped over the edge. In a terrifying moment of slow motion, Tessa felt the horse begin to fall, its balance lost on the treacherous slope. Blake was there in an instant, somehow managing to reach across from his own horse to grab Lily from the carrier just as Tessa's mare lost its footing completely. The horse scrambled, trying to regain its balance, but the edge of the trail crumbled beneath its weight, sending both animal and rider tumbling down the rocky slope. Tessa felt herself falling, the world spinning around her as she hit the ground hard and continued to roll down the mountainside. Pain exploded in her shoulder and hip as she collided with rocks and brush. She heard Blake shouting her name, the sound seeming to come from very far away. Her descent was finally halted by a stunted pine that grew horizontally from the mountainside. Tessa crashed into it, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. She lay there, dazed and in pain, afraid to move lest she continue her fall. "Tessa!" Blake's voice came from above, urgent and frightened. "Tessa, can you hear me?" She tried to respond, but could only manage a groan. Her head was spinning and she tasted blood where she had bitten her lip during the fall. "Don't move," Blake called. "I'm coming down to you. Lily's safe. I've tied her to my saddle." Through the haze of pain, Tessa felt a wave of relief. Lily was safe. That was all that mattered. She heard Blake making his way down to her, the sound of sliding shale and muttered curses marking his progress. Then he was beside her, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries. "Where are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Shoulder," Tessa gasped. "And my hip, I think. I think my ankle's twisted too." Blake carefully helped her into a sitting position, supporting her weight against his chest. From this angle, Tessa could see that they had fallen about 30 feet down a steep slope. Above them, the trail was barely visible, with Blake's horse and the pack horse still standing there, Lily securely fastened to the saddle in her carrier. "The mare?" Tessa asked, dreading the answer. Blake shook his head grimly. "Broke its leg in the fall. I'll have to put it down once I get you back to the trail." Tears welled in Tessa's eyes for the horse, for her own pain, for the sheer terror of the past few minutes. "I'm sorry. It's my fault I panicked." "Nonsense," Blake said firmly. "It was the snake and bad luck. No one's to blame." He examined her injured ankle, his touch careful but sure. "It's swelling, but I don't think it's broken. Can you stand if I help you?" Tessa nodded, gritting her teeth as Blake helped her to her feet. Her ankle screamed in protest as she put weight on it, and she would have fallen if not for Blake's strong arm around her waist. "Lean on me," he instructed. "We'll take it slow." The climb back to the trail was agonizing, each step sending jolts of pain through Tessa's injured body. Blake was patient and steady, finding the safest path and practically carrying her when the slope became too steep for her to manage. By the time they reached the trail, Tessa was exhausted and shaking with pain. Lily began to cry as soon as she saw her mother, straining against the makeshift harness Blake had rigged to keep her secure on his saddle. "It's all right, sweet girl," Tessa called, forcing brightness into her voice despite her pain. "Mama's here. Everything's going to be fine." Blake helped Tessa to a flat rock, then quickly went to attend to the injured mare, leading her away from Lily's sight before ending her suffering with a single shot from his revolver. The sound echoed through the mountains, startling a flock of birds into flight. When he returned, his expression was grim but determined. "We can't make it through the pass today. You need rest, and we're down to one riding horse. There's a hunter's cabin about a mile back down the trail. We can shelter there tonight." Tessa nodded, too exhausted to argue. Blake lifted Lily from the saddle and brought her to Tessa, who hugged the baby tightly despite the pain in her shoulder. Then he helped Tessa onto his horse, handed Lily up to her, and took the reins to lead them back down the trail, the pack horse following behind. The hunter's cabin was little more than a crude shelter, 4 walls of stacked logs with a dirt floor and a stone fireplace. But it was sound and dry, with a pile of firewood stacked against one wall and a rough pallet in one corner. Blake helped Tessa inside, settling her on the pallet before returning to care for the horses. Tessa tried to comfort Lily, who was fussy and frightened after the day's events. Her own pain made it difficult to focus, but she forced herself to sing softly to the baby, stroking her fine hair until she finally calmed. Blake returned with their supplies and quickly set about building a fire in the fireplace. Once it was blazing, he turned his attention to Tessa's injuries, his face set in lines of concern. "I need to check your shoulder," he said. "And your ankle should be wrapped. I'm no doctor, but I've dealt with my share of injuries on the ranch." Tessa nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "You'll need to. My dress." Blake's cheeks colored slightly. "Yes, I'll be as proper as the circumstances allow, but I need to see the injuries." Tessa turned her back to him, allowing him to help her remove the top portion of her dress, leaving her in her chemise. She felt his fingers gently probing her shoulder, which was already darkening with a massive bruise. "It's not dislocated," he said after a moment. "Just badly bruised. Your hip's the same from what I can see. The ankle's the worst, it's starting to swell badly." He moved away to rummage in the packhorse's saddlebags, returning with a flask of whiskey and some strips of cloth. "Drink this first," he said, offering the flask. "It'll help with the pain." Tessa took a small sip, grimacing at the burn. Blake then helped her position her ankle on his lap as he sat beside the pallet. With gentle efficiency, he removed her boot and stocking, revealing an ankle already swollen and discolored. "This will hurt," he warned before beginning to wrap it tightly with the cloth strips. Tessa bit her lip to keep from crying out as he worked, the pressure on her injured ankle sending waves of pain up her leg. When he finished, he eased her leg back onto the pallet and covered her with a blanket from their supplies. "Try to rest," he said, moving to check on Lily, who had fallen asleep on a makeshift bed of saddle blankets near the fire. "I'll fix us something to eat." As Blake moved around the small cabin, heating beans and bacon over the fire and keeping it well stoked against the mountain chill, Tessa watched him through half-closed eyes. Despite the pain and the disastrous turn of events, she felt oddly at peace. There was something about Blake's quiet competence, his unquestioning care for her and Lily, that reached past her defenses to touch her heart. When he brought her a plate of food, she tried to sit up but winced at the movement. Blake immediately set the plate aside and helped her, arranging the blanket to preserve her modesty while positioning her so she could eat. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. "For everything. If you hadn't been there today." "But I was," Blake said simply. "And I always will be if you'll let me." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Tessa looked up to find Blake watching her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Blake," she began, unsure of what to say. "I don't know what the future holds. I'm still. Thomas hasn't been gone that long, and I'm still finding my way." "I understand," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for promises, Tessa, just a chance. A chance to show you what life could be like at Rafter H for both of you." Tessa considered his words, weighing them against the tumult of her own feelings. "I can give you that," she said finally. "A chance, but I need time." Blake's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Time is something we have plenty of out here." They ate in companionable silence after that, listening to the crackling fire and Lily's soft breathing. As night fell, the temperature in the mountains dropped rapidly, and Blake added more wood to the fire, building it up to last through the night. "You should take the pallet," Tessa said as he arranged his bedroll on the dirt floor near the fire. "I've taken your horse. The least I can do is give you a proper place to sleep." Blake shook his head. "I've slept on worse ground than this. You need the comfort more than I do right now." Too tired to argue, Tessa settled back on the pallet, watching as Blake checked on Lily one last time before stretching out on his bedroll. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the gentleness in his expression as he gazed at the sleeping baby. "She looks so peaceful," he murmured. "Children have a remarkable ability to trust that they'll be taken care of." "She trusts you," Tessa said softly. "And so do I." Blake's eyes met hers across the small cabin, the firelight reflecting in their depths. "That means more to me than you know." As Tessa drifted toward sleep, lulled by exhaustion and the whiskey's warmth, she found herself thinking about trust and second chances, and the unexpected ways life could change course in an instant. 3 days ago, she had been struggling against a river's current, certain that she and Lily were about to die. Now she was looking toward a future, Neither she nor Thomas could have imagined one that included the quiet cowboy sleeping across from her, whose courage and kindness had saved them both in more ways than one. The next morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window to wake Tessa from a deep sleep. She stirred, wincing as pain immediately reminded her of yesterday's accident. Blake was already up, tending the fire and warming coffee in a battered pot. Lily was awake too, sitting on his lap while he fed her small pieces of softened biscuit. The domestic scene made Tessa's heart contract with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. She shifted on the pallet, drawing Blake's attention. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "How are you feeling?" "Like I fell down a mountain," Tessa replied with a weak smile, "but I'll live." Blake helped her sit up, then brought her coffee and a plate of biscuits with the last of their bacon. "I've been thinking about our situation," he said as she ate. "With only one riding horse and your injuries, we need to change our plans." "What do you suggest?" Tessa asked. "We're about 6 hours from Rafter H if we follow the valley instead of going over the pass. It's longer but easier terrain. I can ride with Lily in front of me and you can ride behind. We'll have to go slow, but we should make it by nightfall." Tessa nodded, grateful for his practical thinking. "That sounds sensible. The other option is for me to ride ahead with Lily, get her safely to the ranch, then come back for you. But I don't like the idea of leaving you alone up here, even for a few hours." "Neither do I," Tessa admitted. "Let's try your first plan." Once they had eaten and packed their supplies, Blake helped Tessa dress, his hands efficient but gentle as he helped her into her clothes. Her ankle was still swollen, making it impossible to pull on her boot, so Blake wrapped it in an extra shirt before helping her outside. Mounting the horse was an ordeal that left Tessa gasping with pain despite Blake's careful assistance. Once she was settled, with Lily secured in front of Blake, they set off down the trail, following a gradual descent into the valley below. The day passed in a haze of discomfort for Tessa. Each step the horse took sent jolts of pain through her injured body. But she gritted her teeth and endured, focusing on the solid warmth of Blake's back against her chest, and the knowledge that each hour brought them closer to the safety and comfort of Rafter H. They stopped frequently to rest and to tend to Lily's needs. At each stop, Blake's care for both of them was evident in every action: the way he eased Tessa down from the horse, how he changed Lily's makeshift diaper with surprising skill, his insistence that Tessa drink water and eat small amounts to keep up her strength. By late afternoon, the landscape had begun to look familiar: rolling grasslands dotted with stands of cottonwood and aspen, with distant mountains forming a dramatic backdrop. Tessa recognized a distinctive rock formation that they had passed on their outward journey. "We're close," Blake confirmed when she mentioned it. "Another hour, maybe less." True to his word, the ranch came into view just as the sun was beginning to set, the buildings golden in the late afternoon light. As they approached, Tessa felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. After everything that had happened, Rafter H looked like exactly what it was: a haven in the wilderness. Hank emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard, his weathered face creasing with concern as he took in their bedraggled appearance and the absence of Tessa's horse. "What in tarnation happened?" he demanded, helping Blake ease Tessa down from the saddle. "Accident on the mountain trail," Blake explained tersely. "Tessa's horse went down. She's hurt her ankle and shoulder." Hank's expression softened as he looked at Tessa. "Let's get you inside, madam. You look about done in." He reached for Lily, who went to him willingly, recognizing the friendly face from their previous stay. "And how's the little miss?" "No worse for wear, I hope." "She's fine," Tessa assured him. "Blake managed to save her before my horse fell." Hank shot Blake a look that contained both approval and something like pride. Always was quick on his feet, this boy. He led the way to the house, Lily chattering happily in his arms. "Sarah's room's all ready for you, just like you left it." The next few days passed in a blur of rest and recovery for Tessa. Her ankle improved steadily with regular applications of cold compresses and careful wrapping, while the bruises on her shoulder and hip faded from angry purple to yellowish green. Hank proved to be as skilled at nursing as he was at cooking, bringing her herbal teas for pain and ensuring she ate regularly to regain her strength. Blake was a constant presence, dividing his time between ranch work and checking on Tessa and Lily. He brought wildflowers to brighten her room, carved a tiny wooden horse for Lily to play with, and spent evenings reading aloud from one of Sarah's books while Tessa sewed by lamplight, repairing clothes that had been damaged in their journey. A week after their return to Rafter H, Tessa was able to walk with only a slight limp, though long distances still tired her quickly. She had begun to help Hank with cooking and other household tasks, insisting on contributing to the household that had so generously taken her and Lily in. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Blake broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "Elias Donovan sent word with the mail rider yesterday," he said. "He's found a buyer for James's homestead, a young couple from back east looking for a fresh start. They're offering $50. Tessa considered this. With the $20 gold they'd found in James's cabin, plus the $50 from the sale, she would have a modest sum to build upon. That seems fair. The land wasn't worth much and the cabin needs a lot of work." Blake nodded. "I thought so too. I told the rider to let Donovan know you accept the offer." He hesitated, then added, "Of course, this means you'll need to decide what comes next." Tessa had been thinking about little else during her convalescence. The time at Rafter H had given her a glimpse of what life could be like for her and Lily secure, surrounded by good people, with the beauty of Wyoming's wild landscape as a backdrop to their days. But there was also the complication of her growing feelings for Blake, feelings that both excited and frightened her. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "that Lily and I might stay on here at least through the summer, if that's still agreeable to you and Hank." Blake's face lit up with a smile that made Tessa's heart skip. "More than agreeable. Hank's already talking about building a proper crib for Lily and maybe adding a room onto the house before winter." "A room? But we wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition," Blake assured her. "This place was always meant for a family. When I built it, I had hopes, dreams that didn't work out." He looked out over the land, his expression contemplative. "After the war, I was pretty lost. Building Rafter H gave me purpose, but it's been a lonely kind of purpose at times." Tessa understood what he wasn't saying, that her and Lily's presence had filled a void in his life, just as his had filled the void in theirs. "We're grateful for your kindness, Blake, truly. But I don't want charity." "It's not charity I'm offering," Blake said, turning to look at her directly. "I care for you, Tessa, for both of you, more than I thought possible in such a short time. I'm not asking for any declarations from you. I know it's too soon, and you're still healing in more ways than one. But I want you to know that there's a place for you here, a permanent place if you want it." The sincerity in his voice moved Tessa deeply. "I care for you too," she admitted softly. "And Lily adores you. But you're right, it is soon. I need to be sure, for her sake as much as mine." Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As summer bloomed across the Wyoming landscape, Rafter H flourished with new energy. Tessa's presence brought a feminine touch to the house that had been lacking since Sarah's departure. Curtains appeared at windows, flowers brightened tables, and the aroma of home-baked bread regularly wafted from the kitchen. Lily thrived in the ranch environment, crawling everywhere at first, then pulling herself up to stand, and finally taking her first tottering steps just after her first birthday in July. Blake was there to witness the milestone, his face alight with pride as if she were his own child. The relationship between Tessa and Blake developed slowly but steadily. They were careful with each other, mindful of the complexities of their situation, but increasingly unable to deny the deepening bond between them. Blake never pressed for more than Tessa was ready to give, respecting her need to honor Thomas's memory while also moving forward with her life. By August, the additional room Blake had promised was taking shape, attached to the main house and designed with Tessa's input. It would serve as a proper bedroom for Lily as she grew, with windows positioned to catch the morning sun and shelves for books and toys. One evening, as they walked along the creek that ran through Rafter H property, Blake stopped beneath a towering cottonwood tree. Lily was back at the house with Hank, who had developed a grandfatherly devotion to the toddler. "I've been thinking," Blake said, his expression serious, "about us, about the future." Tessa felt her heart quicken. "Oh, it's been nearly 4 months since the river. 4 months of getting to know each other, of building a life here together." He took her hands in his. "I know it might still seem soon to you, but I need you to know how I feel. I love you, Tessa. I love Lily too, as if she were my own. And I want to make this arrangement permanent if you'll have me." Tessa's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Blake, you don't need to answer now," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. That my intentions are honorable and that I'm committed to you and Lily no matter how long it takes." Tessa shook her head, smiling through her tears. "I wasn't going to ask for more time. I was going to say yes." Blake stared at her, momentarily speechless. "Yes, yes," she confirmed. "I love you too. I think I have since the river, since you risked your life to save my daughter without a moment's hesitation. Everything since then has only confirmed what kind of man you are." She squeezed his hands. "The kind of man I want to spend my life with, the kind of father I want for Lily." Blake's face transformed with a joy that matched her own. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, full of promise and tenderness, and when they broke apart, Tessa felt as if something long broken inside her had finally begun to heal. "I should do this properly," Blake said, suddenly dropping to one knee. "Tessa Armstrong, will you marry me? Will you make Rafter H your home and let me be a father to Lily?" "Yes," Tessa said again, her voice steady and sure. "With all my heart, yes." They were married in late September, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the first hint of winter crispness was in the air. The ceremony was small but meaningful, held in the little church at Whitewater Creek, with Elias Donovan's wife playing the organ and Mrs. Baxter weeping openly in the front pew. Hank stood as Blake's best man, while Mrs. Donovan held Lily, who wore a tiny dress made from one of Sarah's old gowns. Blake's sister Sarah had sent a telegram of congratulations from California, promising to visit in the spring with her husband and new baby. As Tessa and Blake exchanged vows, she couldn't help but reflect on the strange and winding path that had brought her to this moment. The river that had nearly taken everything from her had instead given her a new beginning, a new love, a new family, a new home. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Blake kissed her with a reverence that made her heart swell. Then he lifted Lily into his arms, creating their first moment as a true family. "Mrs. Harrington," he whispered as they walked out of the church into the golden autumn sunlight. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Tessa replied, squeezing his hand. "So do I." Epilogue. 5 years later, the spring flood had come early to Wyoming Territory in 1878, turning Blackwater River into a roaring torrent that reminded Tessa all too vividly of that fateful day 5 years earlier. She stood on the porch of the expanded Rafter H Ranch house, watching as Blake and their 3-year-old son Samuel built a miniature dam in the drainage ditch by the barn. Lily, now 6 years old and the spitting image of Tessa with her chestnut hair and honey-colored eyes, sat on the porch step, carefully forming letters in a small slate. She had inherited her grandfather's love of learning, and Blake had promised to build a proper schoolhouse on the ranch once there were enough children to fill it. That day wasn't far off. The neighboring ranches and homesteads had multiplied in recent years, bringing more families to the area. Rafter H had prospered too, with Blake's careful management and Tessa's shrewd investments of her inheritance from James's homestead. They had expanded the herd, built a larger barn, and even planted an apple orchard that was just beginning to bear fruit. Hank still lived with them, now more family than employee, though he insisted on earning his keep by teaching Samuel and Lily to ride and helping with the endless chores a successful ranch required. Tessa rested a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby within kick vigorously. This third child, a girl, she was certain would arrive by early summer, completing their family in a way that sometimes made Tessa's heart ache with its perfection. She still thought of Thomas occasionally, especially when Lily did something that reminded her of him. But the sharp pain of grief had long since mellowed into a gentle remembrance. Thomas would be happy, she believed, to know that she and Lily had found such joy. Blake looked up from his play with Samuel, catching her eye across the yard. Even after 5 years of marriage, that look still had the power to make her pulse quicken. He whispered something to Samuel, then jogged across to the porch, taking the steps 2 at a time. "Everything all right?" he asked, resting a hand on her stomach. "You looked thoughtful." "Just remembering," Tessa said, leaning into his embrace. "How different things might have been if you hadn't happened to be hunting near the river that day." Blake's arms tightened around her. "I've never been more grateful for a missed shot in my life. That pronghorn led me right to you." "The river nearly took her baby," Lily piped up from her spot on the steps, reciting the story she'd heard countless times, "until the cowboy dove in and carried them both to shore." Blake chuckled, reaching down to ruffle Lily's hair. "That's right, sweetheart. And I've been carrying you both ever since. And Samuel too," Lily added seriously. "And the new baby when it comes." "And the new baby," Blake agreed, his hand still resting protectively on Tessa's stomach. "That's what families do. They carry each other through whatever comes." As Samuel ran up to join them, demanding his father's attention for some new discovery, Tessa looked out over the land that had become her home, the rolling grasslands, the distant mountains, the clear blue Wyoming sky. The river that had nearly claimed their lives now watered their cattle and nourished their crops, its power harnessed for good. Life on the frontier was never easy. There would always be floods and droughts, harsh winters and scorching summers, challenges that tested their resilience and strength. But standing here, surrounded by the family she and Blake had built together, Tessa knew they could weather whatever came their way. The river had nearly taken everything from her that day 5 years ago. Instead, it had given her everything that mattered: a brave cowboy with a heart as vast as the Wyoming sky, a home where love and hope flourished, and a future as boundless as the western horizon.